everyone for coming. I was saying this in the breakout group, but I wish I could be there in person. Unfortunately, that is not the way the world has worked out in the last several weeks, so hopefully sometime soon. I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about this sort of wild moment we're in and how it relates to our book. And then we'll get into some of the content, which dovetails really well, and then Daniel will talk about other parts of the book and fill in, whatever I left off. So yeah, just to say a little bit about where we are. I mean, there's obviously books will be written about this moment in the years to come. The one thing that I have been really noticing, I think today especially, is just how many of the lies we've been told about the economy is crumbling down, right? We have been told for years that any sort of spending we want to do on anything really that makes people's lives better, anything other than a war, essentially, or tax breaks for the wealthy, that's just too expensive. We don't have the time for it. We don't have the money for it. We need to focus on other things. That's nice that you have these dreams, but give it up, right? And we see that's just not the case at all, right? There was, we knew this already, but there has never been a shortage of money in the United States. There's been a shortage of political will to do the things we need with it, right? We had, Secretary Steve Mnuchin talking today about how this is not the time to worry about the deficit, floating a stimulus package that is a mess in nearly every way possible, but that is notably over $1 trillion. And we talk a little bit in the introduction of this book about the last economic crisis and how Obama's advisors, most notably Larry Summers, in a now kind of infamous memo, refused to pass a stimulus that was more than $1 trillion. Just flat out refused. That was not going to fly. America's too conservative for that. We can't do it. So we are seeing now that that's a total lie, right? And we have this sort of wild, very scary, I think, unstable moment that I think it can be, frankly, can be a little hard to see political possibility in it. But I think that's exactly what's there. And we are, as in any crisis, as people like Naomi Klein have written about, whatever sort of ideas are lying around are the ones that will get picked up. And the right, as we know, has a lot of very bad ideas to privatize things, to hand more money away to the wealthiest actors in society, and as we've been seeing, to bail out some of the most carbon-intensive industries on the planet, airlines, cruise lines, et cetera, and bail out in the sense of giving, essentially handing money over to the CEOs of these companies to do whatever they want with it, right? Just to, pour that into stock buybacks, to fire workers, to, continue doing the same sort of shady and often speculative activity that they have been doing for years. And the narrative here is a little less clear than in the financial crisis, but this is not, these are not all the types of activity that we need going into the future. This is not the sort of foundations of a stable 21st century economy to be pouring money into the world's most carbon intensive sectors. And so what I and Daniel and Thea, Ria Francos and Alyssa Battistoni and I lay out are, in the book are some better ideas to both for the Green New Deal itself and also how to use, these political moments which never seem ideal, right? There's never going to be some crisis which comes along and seems perfectly suited to, put eco-socialism into, right? That is not unfortunately how the world works, right? But these are moments of rupture, these are moments of disruption, and moments of possibility, even when they can, cannot feel like that. So one idea that I have been writing about recently and that we talk about in the book, and I'll talk briefly about here, is the concept of nationalizing the fossil fuel industry. And in a related way, bringing electric utilities under public ownership, which I think relate back to where we are now in a sort of interesting way. So to start with the fossil fuel industry itself, this is one of the industries that the White House has sort of suggested that we prop up, which is interesting considering this is an industry which, as we know, and I'm sure everyone in this call is familiar with, has been destroying the planet for decades. But the type of extraction that we do most here in the United States, shale drilling in particular, has never been on its own, on purely business terms, leaving the climate aside, has never been sustainable, right? These companies have by and large never turned a profit. They are funded by massive amounts of debt. They, have just taken essentially the largesse of Wall Street and the kind of low interest rate economy that's persisted since the last recession, and just built these giant companies, essentially drilling up fuel we don't need, right? Drilling up gas and oil that there was no pressing domestic demand for, that there was no real need for, purely just to make people rich, right? And so we are in this kind of new era, very, very reduced demand for oil. There's other factors at play. There's geopolitical factors. There is the increasing divestment, in part at the behest of social movements and climate organizers around the world from fossil fuel stocks. These companies are reaching a real reckoning point, particularly U.S.-based natural gas and oil drillers in the sort of shale sector. And so with these mounting levels of corporate debt, sort of bond maturities coming due this year and the next 5 years, it's very likely that these companies will go bankrupt, that many of them will go bankrupt. We saw a rash of those last year. We're likely to see more going forward. And we kind of know, we've already seen what the White House's response to that will be, which will be to bail those companies out. And so what does that look like? As we know from bailouts past, that will give money to the CEOs and leave all of the workers in the industry. There are about 1.6 million nationwide, which is not insignificant. Essentially leave people out to dry, right? And not just workers in those sectors, but entire communities. There are places like West Texas, there are communities around Appalachia, who have tax bases which are hugely dependent on these extractive industries. These are well-paid jobs. For the most part, people without a high school degree can make a lot of money, which is great. And a bailout that essentially forestalls a crisis that is coming for this sector will do basically nothing for them, right? And so what we propose in the book, and which I've written about more recently, sort of in the context of the last couple of weeks, is to nationalize these companies, right, which are already hugely devalued as oil prices have crashed, and to create an off-ramp away from fossil fuels and toward the low carbon economy we need. And so what can this do? This can fund, as is in Bernie Sanders' plan for a Green New Deal, 5 years wage parity. This can, really set people up to live dignified lives. People who, have really built the economy we live in, and built, things that they have done work that deserves to be respected, and sort of provide an alternative to bankruptcy, which, as we've seen in the case of the coal industry, always screws workers over, or private equity, which is a sort of faster route toward that, right? And so this is actually a pretty simple transaction, as was pointed out yesterday. The 4 biggest oil producers in the United States could be bought up with $300 billion, which from the perspective of the federal government is relative chump change, and could wind down production very, very quickly, and make sure that energy needs are provided for, but make sure that that's not being done on a for-profit basis, and sort of taking the profit motive out of the equation, right? And making sure that the future of these companies is one that is both looking out for the people who have created value for them, and also looking out for the collective well-being of the planet. And I think what's important to note about that is that while I think nationalization, while maybe it sounds good to many people on this call, has traditionally been a sort of third rail issue in American politics in particular, for no good reason, right? We do nationalization all the time. Most recently, after in the couple months after 9/11, the Bush administration nationalized airport security and created TSA, basically whole cloth, right? And displaced private industry, these sort of private companies, many of them which are involved in things like ICE detention facilities, displaced a whole swath of the private sector, and that was largely uncontroversial because it took place in the context of a crisis. And so what nationalization of the fossil fuel company can do is both be in that tradition and do something that is not very strange in American politics, and it can also sort of retool all of the existing support we already give to the fossil fuel industry. Very conservative estimates put U.S. direct and indirect subsidies to that industry at $26 billion per year. The IMF, which counts in sort of more things like sort of unpaid health costs and detriment to the environment, puts global fossil fuel subsidies at $5.1 trillion per year. So it's not as if this is a new government intervention, right? We are changing the way that the government intervenes in the economy to be for the collective well-being and not for the well-being of fossil fuel executives, right? And so I happen to think this is a pretty moderate proposal in the grand scheme of things. It's not, so far outside the lines of what we've seen before, and actually, is I think probably the best kind of path away from a sector that, as I mentioned before, is already failing, right? It's already sort of coming apart at the seams. So I think to give Daniel a bit of time, I'll talk briefly about work, and maybe we can get to talking about utilities in the Q&A. But I think, as we're thinking about what it looks like to transition workers out of the fossil fuel sector in particular, something else we talk about in the book is a much broader concept of work. Conversations about the just transition have tended to focus on what the transition looks like for people who are in the extractive industry into the clean energy economy, right? So you imagine coal miners going, or oil and gas workers going to mount solar panels on homes or businesses, or hoist up wind turbines. And what we argue in the book is there's actually a much broader array of work that is bound up in the fossil fuel economy, and there's a much broader definition of a green job, which goes well beyond, the actual, production and installation and deployment of green energy itself. And so as we're thinking about kind of what alternative employment can look like for folks, and as we transition in this economy, which is hopefully very different than the one we know, that there are already sectors of the economy which are low carbon and which have been in reality some of the most militant sectors in the economy. Thinking of teaching, I'm sure folks have been following sort of a wave of teacher strikes, most recently kicking off since 2012, the Chicago teachers strike against Rahm Emanuel, and then nursing, which has been historically very unionized sector and fairly militant unions at that. And so what we argue, and I'll sort of end it here, is that we have to really expand our definition of what counts as a green job, not only for just sort of an analytic point, in that we need a lot more low carbon work, right? But that we actually need to build powerful coalitions in order to get any of this to happen. And in order to do that, we need more people on our side. And so people have to be able to see themselves in the Green New Deal. And that is a coalition that has to extend, well beyond sort of just workers in the current extractive economy. And so I think we are excited, and I hope this comes up through the rest of the conversation, to build with folks who are, working with labor sort of across the spectrum, and to, you know, really think about how to build the biggest Green New Deal coalition possible, because we know, you know, the fossil fuel industry is not going to want to be nationalized, and that there will need to be a sort of massive amount of people power needed in order to make anything like that possible. So I'll end it there. Kick it to Daniel.